The morning sun cast gentle shadows across the pristine lawns of Millfield House as the village of Little Wickham prepared for its annual Rose Festival. Mrs. Constance Weatherby, the manor's formidable owner, surveyed her prize-winning garden with the satisfaction of a general reviewing victorious troops. Her hybrid roses, cultivated over 30 years of meticulous care, stood in perfect formation along the winding paths, their blooms heavy with morning dew and promise. Miss Jane Marple, having accepted her dear friend Mrs. Bantry's invitation to attend, settled quietly into a wicker chair beneath the old oak tree. Her knitting basket rested beside her, though her pale blue eyes were far more interested in observing the bustling preparations than in attending to her needlework. The gentle elderly lady appeared to be nothing more than another village resident enjoying the morning's festivities, yet her sharp mind was already cataloguing the subtle tensions that seemed to shimmer beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect gathering. The Rose Festival had become Little Wickham's most celebrated annual event, drawing visitors from neighboring counties and raising substantial funds for the church restoration. This year's competition promised to be particularly fierce, with several renowned horticulturists expected to attend the judging. Mrs. Weatherby's own entries dominated the premium categories, a fact that had generated considerable resentment among her fellow competitors over the years. Young David Morrison, recently returned from London after a failed business venture, moved nervously among the display tables, adjusting his modest contribution with trembling hands. His small collection of heritage roses, rescued from his deceased grandmother's cottage garden, seemed humble beside the grand displays of more established growers. Miss Marple noticed how his eyes frequently darted toward Mrs. Weatherby's magnificent specimens with an expression that blended admiration with something approaching desperation. Mrs. Helen Ashford, the village's self-appointed social coordinator and Mrs. Weatherby's closest rival, supervised the refreshment arrangements with barely contained frustration. Her own roses, while undeniably beautiful, had never achieved the perfection of Mrs. Weatherby's specimens, a fact that had been a source of considerable bitterness between the two women for several seasons. Miss Marple observed the subtle interplay between the ladies with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed countless similar rivalries throughout her many years of village life. Dr. Geoffrey Hartwell, the appointed head judge and respected member of the Royal Horticultural Society, arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, his authoritative presence immediately commanding attention from the assembled participants. His reputation for absolute fairness was matched only by his notorious intolerance for anything less than perfection, a combination that had made him both respected and feared throughout the county's horticultural circles. As the morning progressed and early visitors began to arrive, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations while maintaining the appearance of being entirely absorbed in her knitting. She noted the way Mrs. Weatherby's smile never quite reached her eyes when greeting competitors, the manner in which young Morrison seemed to hover protectively near his modest display, and the barely perceptible tension in Mrs. Ashford's voice as she directed volunteers. The formal judging was scheduled to begin at 11:30, with results announced during the afternoon tea service. Until then, participants could only wait and watch as Dr. Hartwell made his methodical rounds, examining each entry with the thoroughness of a scientist conducting crucial research. It was precisely 11:15 when the peaceful morning was shattered by a piercing scream from the direction of the prize rose garden. Miss Evelyn Carter, Mrs. Weatherby's timid companion, stumbled from behind the tall yew hedge, her face ashen, hands pressed to her mouth in horror. Dr. Hartwell was first to respond, striding quickly toward the distraught woman. "Miss Carter, what is it? What's happened?" The companion could only point a trembling finger toward the secluded corner of the garden where Mrs. Weatherby's prized crimson glory roses bloomed in magnificent profusion. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she struggled to form words. A crowd of concerned villagers followed Dr. Hartwell as he pushed past the petrified woman into the rose garden's inner sanctum. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, her movements deliberate, and joined the solemn procession with the measured pace of someone who had encountered such scenes before. They found Mrs. Constance Weatherby lying motionless among her beloved roses, her gardening gloves still clutched in one hand, her secateurs fallen beside her on the carefully tended earth. The celebrated horticulturist lay perfectly still, her eyes staring sightlessly at the morning sky, a thin line of foam visible at the corner of her mouth. Nearby, an overturned teacup rested in the soil, its contents having soaked into the dark earth around the prize-winning blooms. Dr. Hartwell knelt beside the still form, his practiced hands checking for signs of life before shaking his head gravely. The peaceful rose festival had been transformed in an instant into something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Miss Marple remained at the edge of the gathered crowd, her keen eyes taking in every detail, the position of the body, the scattered gardening tools, the overturned cup, and most particularly, the various expressions of shock, fear, and something else entirely on the faces surrounding her. The morning's observations of tensions and rivalries suddenly took on a much darker significance. The game, she knew with quiet certainty, had begun. The silence that followed Dr. Hartwell's pronouncement stretched like a taut wire, broken only by Miss Carter's strangled sob and the incongruous sound of bees continuing their work among the roses. The word poisoned hung in the morning air, with the weight of an accusation, transforming the peaceful garden party into something far more sinister. Dr. Hartwell straightened from his examination, his face grave as he addressed the stunned gathering. "Someone must telephone the police immediately. This is most certainly not a natural death." His medical training had revealed what the casual observer might have missed: the telltale foam at Mrs. Weatherby's lips, the peculiar positioning of her body, and most significantly, the acrid scent that still lingered faintly around the overturned teacup. Miss Marple, maintaining her position at the garden's edge, noted with quiet interest how each person processed this terrible revelation. Young Morrison stepped backward involuntarily, his face draining of color, while Mrs. Ashford seemed to gather herself with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crises. Miss Carter, still trembling from her discovery, was gently led to a nearby garden bench, though her eyes remained fixed on her employer's still form with an expression of bewildered grief. The village constable, P.C. Williams, arrived within minutes of being summoned, his bicycle clattering against the garden gate in his haste. A conscientious man more familiar with settling disputes over property boundaries than investigating murders, he approached the scene with careful deliberation, acutely aware of his limitations in such grave circumstances. "Nobody is to leave the premises until further notice," P.C. Williams announced after conferring briefly with Dr. Hartwell. "Detective Inspector Reeves from the county police has been notified and should arrive within the hour. Until then, everyone must remain available for questioning." As the initial shock began to subside, the inevitable speculation commenced. Mrs. Patterson, the vicar's wife, was first to voice what many were thinking. "It must have been someone from outside the village. None of us would ever do such a terrible thing. Perhaps a vagrant or someone with a grudge from Mrs. Weatherby's London days." This comfortable theory found immediate support among several participants, offering as it did the reassuring possibility that the murderer was not among their familiar circle. However, Miss Marple observed that not everyone seemed convinced by this explanation. Miss Carter shook her head with surprising firmness. "Mrs. Weatherby had no enemies that I knew of," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed garden. "She was sometimes exacting, yes, but never cruel. Whoever did this knew her morning routine, her habit of taking tea in the rose garden at precisely 11 o'clock. Dr. Hartwell nodded gravely. Miss Carter raises a crucial point. The timing suggests someone intimately familiar with Mrs. Weatherby's schedule. This was not a random act. The implications of this observation settled over the group like morning frost. If the murderer had known Mrs. Weatherby's routine so precisely, they were almost certainly someone from the immediate community. The comfortable theory of an outside intruder began to crumble under logical scrutiny. Mrs. Ashford, perhaps sensing the growing unease, attempted to redirect the conversation while simultaneously introducing new possibilities. "We shouldn't speculate about such things," she said, though her own voice betrayed considerable interest. "Though I must say, Constance did have a way of making enemies without meaning to. Remember that disagreement with young Morrison last week over his grandmother's rose cuttings? She accused him of stealing her hybrid varieties." David Morrison flushed crimson at this pointed reference. "That's not fair, Mrs. Ashford. She was mistaken about those roses. My grandmother cultivated them for years before Mrs. Weatherby ever came to Little Wickham." His voice trembled with indignation and something that might have been fear. Miss Marple, from her strategic position, continued her quiet observations while maintaining the appearance of being absorbed in her knitting. She noted the small iron gate in the yew hedge that stood slightly ajar, its latch bearing fresh scratches that caught the morning light. A crushed rose petal lay on the gravel path, evidence of hasty passage that others had overlooked in their shock. The village gossip machine, temporarily stunned into silence, now began operating with renewed vigor. Mrs. Higgins, the butcher's wife, whispered about Mrs. Weatherby's mysterious cousin who was expected that very afternoon. Mr. Henderson, the retired schoolmaster, mused about the considerable inheritance that would now pass to unknown heirs. Each theory spawned 3 more, creating a web of speculation that grew more complex by the minute. "And what about that new gardener fellow?" Mrs. Finch declared with conviction. "Always skulking about, never quite meeting your eye. I told my Herbert there was something shifty about him." Arthur Keene, the head gardener who had served Millfield House faithfully for over a decade, shifted uncomfortably at this suggestion, but remained silent. Miss Marple noted his reaction with interest, particularly the way his eyes darted toward the overturned teacup before looking away. As the speculation continued, Miss Marple drifted closer to Miss Carter, who sat clutching her handkerchief with white-knuckled fingers. "Such a shock for you, dear," she murmured sympathetically. "Finding her like that. You mentioned she always took her morning tea at 11? Miss Carter nodded miserably. "Every day without fail. She said it helped her think clearly before the day's visitors arrived. She was so particular about her routine." She paused, then added with obvious distress, "I should have been with her if I hadn't been helping with the festival. Preparations." Now, Miss Marple soothed gently. "You mustn't blame yourself. These things happen when they will, regardless of our presence." She paused delicately. "I suppose she prepared her own tea this morning?" "Oh, no," Miss Carter replied quickly. "I always prepared it for her. Earl Grey with 1 sugar, served in the blue cornflower china. She was most particular about that." Her brow furrowed slightly. "Though I'm not certain about this morning. Everything was so rushed with the festival preparations." Miss Marple filed this information away with the same care she devoted to counting stitches. The morning's tragedy was revealing itself to be far more complex than a simple case of outside interference. The truth, she suspected, lay much closer to home, hidden among the familiar faces and long-established relationships of Little Wickham's seemingly peaceful community. The game, as she had observed earlier, had indeed begun. Detective Inspector Reeves arrived at Millfield House with the quiet efficiency that marked his 15 years of investigating the darker aspects of human nature. A tall, methodical man with prematurely gray hair and penetrating eyes, he surveyed the rose garden with professional detachment while P.C. Williams provided a hurried summary of the morning's tragic events. His younger colleague, Sergeant Miller, followed with evidence collection materials and a leather notebook, already prepared to document what promised to be a complex investigation. After examining Mrs. Weatherby's body and conferring briefly with Dr. Hartwell about the apparent cyanide poisoning, Inspector Reeves gathered the assembled villagers in the manor's elegant drawing room. The polished mahogany furniture and family portraits seemed incongruous as the backdrop for a murder investigation. Yet the inspector's methodical approach quickly established the necessary atmosphere of serious inquiry. Mrs. Weatherby died from what appears to be cyanide poisoning, administered between 10:30 and 11 o'clock this morning, he announced without preamble. The poison was almost certainly delivered in her morning tea. I need to establish who had access to that tea and who knew about her daily routine of taking refreshment in the rose garden at precisely 11 o'clock. Miss Carter, still pale but attempting to compose herself, responded first. I usually prepared Mrs. Weatherby's morning tea without fail. Earl Grey with 1 sugar, served in her blue cornflower china. However, this morning was different because of the festival preparations. Her voice grew smaller as she continued. I was helping Mrs. Ashford with the refreshment arrangements from quite early. Mrs. Weatherby said she would manage her own tea today, that I shouldn't worry about the usual routine. This revelation sent a ripple of significance through the room. Miss Marple, maintaining her unobtrusive position near the window, noted how this uncertainty about the tea preparation opened possibilities that hadn't existed moments before. If Miss Carter hadn't prepared the tea, then anyone familiar with the house could have introduced the poison. Arthur Keene cleared his throat nervously. Begging your pardon, Inspector, but Mrs. Weatherby sometimes used the small conservatory pantry when she wanted to prepare refreshments quickly. There's a spirit kettle there, and she kept her special china in the cabinet. Anyone familiar with the house would know about it. Inspector Reeves made careful notes while studying each face in the room. I need to understand everyone's movements between 10 and 11:30 this morning. The responses revealed a complex pattern of activity that would challenge any investigator. Mrs. Ashford had been supervising refreshment preparations, moving frequently between different areas. David Morrison had arrived early to tend his display, though he admitted to being alone during the crucial period. Dr. Hartwell had been examining competition entries methodically throughout the garden. It was during this questioning that a sleek black motor car appeared in the drive, drawing everyone's attention to the windows. A woman in an elegant traveling suit emerged, her face drawn with shock as she took in the police presence and gathered villagers. "Good heavens!" she exclaimed as she approached the drawing room. "What on earth has happened?" "I'm Eleanor Vance, Mrs. Weatherby's cousin from London. I was expected this afternoon for tea." The arrival of a potential heir, previously unmentioned in the morning's conversations, added an entirely new dimension to the investigation. Inspector Reeves studied Mrs. Vance carefully as she absorbed the news of her cousin's death, noting her genuine shock while also recognizing the significance of her unexpected presence. "Mrs. Vance, I'm afraid your cousin has been murdered," the inspector said gently but directly. "When did you last communicate with her?" "Just yesterday by telephone," Eleanor replied, sinking into a chair. "Constance invited me specifically for the Rose Festival. She said she had something important to discuss regarding the family estate." Her eyes widened as the implications became clear. "Surely you don't suspect that But I've only just arrived." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing these exchanges while appearing to concentrate on her knitting, found herself mentally cataloguing several intriguing details that seemed to escape the other's notice. During the inspector's examination of the conservatory pantry, she had managed a brief, seemingly innocent glance at the tea preparation area. The sugar bowl, hastily returned by a nervous volunteer, contained 6 remaining cubes, but one appeared slightly different from the others. Duller in finish, with edges that seemed faintly irregular and a tiny pinprick on one side that caught the light strangely. More significantly, she had noticed during the initial investigation that the overturned teacup in the rose garden bore no trace of the blue cornflower pattern that Miss Carter had mentioned. Instead, it appeared to be plain white china with a thin gilt line, a detail that suggested either Miss Carter's memory was faulty or someone had deliberately substituted different china to obscure the trail of evidence. As Inspector Reeves continued his methodical questioning, the web of relationships and potential motives grew increasingly complex. David Morrison's flush deepened when Mrs. Ashford mentioned his recent dispute with Mrs. Weatherby over his grandmother's roses. She accused me quite publicly of trying to pass off common varieties as her prize-winning hybrids, Mrs. Ashford explained with barely concealed satisfaction. It was quite the scene at the last village fete. Morrison's defensive response revealed both hurt and anger. That's completely untrue. My grandmother cultivated those roses for decades before Mrs. Weatherby ever came to Little Wickham. She threatened to have me banned from all future competitions. Dr. Hartwell, when questioned about his relationship with the deceased, maintained his professional composure despite Mrs. Ashford's subtle implications about favoritism in judging. My assessments have always been absolutely impartial, he stated firmly, though Miss Marple noted a slight tension in his voice that suggested he was well aware of such suspicions. Arthur Keane's testimony proved particularly interesting when he mentioned seeing a figure near the conservatory, around 10:40, though the morning mist had obscured the person's identity. Couldn't make out who it was, he admitted reluctantly. Just someone moving purposefully toward the side entrance. As the questioning proceeded, Miss Marple found herself constructing a mental map of the morning's events, noting the various threads that connected each person to both opportunity and motive. The pattern was complex, with multiple suspects having both access to the poison delivery method and reasons for resenting Mrs. Weatherby's domineering personality and competitive advantages. Yet something about the obvious nature of these connections troubled her experienced mind. In her long observation of human nature, she had learned that the most apparent motives often concealed deeper, more carefully hidden truths. The substituted china, the tampered sugar cube, and the mysterious figure near the conservatory suggested a level of premeditation that went beyond simple garden variety resentment. The arrival of Eleanor Vance had introduced yet another variable into an already complex equation. Her mention of important family business discussions raised questions about inheritance and long-term financial motives that might dwarf the immediate concerns about rose competition prizes and gardening disputes. As Inspector Reeves concluded his initial round of questioning and began organizing more detailed individual interviews, Miss Marple settled back into her chair, with her knitting appearing to be nothing more than a harmless elderly observer. However, her sharp mind was already working through the implications of what she had observed, particularly the careful attention someone had paid to details like china patterns and sugar cube preparation. The truth, she suspected, lay not in the obvious resentments and public disputes that dominated the surface conversations, but in some deeper motivation that connected the victim's daily habits, her family relationships, and the intricate social dynamics of Little Wickham's seemingly peaceful community. The game, as she had recognized from the beginning, was proving to be far more sophisticated than anyone yet realized. Inspector Reeves concluded his preliminary examination of the conservatory pantry with a methodical precision that had served him well throughout his career. Sergeant Miller approached with a small evidence bag containing what appeared to be an ordinary sugar cube, though closer inspection revealed subtle irregularities that immediately captured the inspector's attention. "This cube differs from the others in the bowl," Miller reported quietly. "The edges appear slightly softened, and there's what looks like a tiny puncture mark on one side, as if something had been injected into it." Miss Marple, who had drifted closer with the unobtrusive manner of someone merely seeking a better view, observed the evidence with keen interest. "How very clever," she murmured, her knitting needles clicking softly. One would hardly notice such a small alteration, particularly if one were accustomed to taking sugar regularly. The poison would dissolve quickly in hot tea, leaving little trace. Dr. Hartwell, summoned to examine the evidence, confirmed the inspector's suspicions. Cyanide is highly soluble in hot liquids. A concentrated dose, injected into a sugar cube and allowed to dry, would be virtually undetectable until consumed. The victim would have perhaps a minute or two before the effects became irreversible. The revelation sent a chill through the assembled company. This was not a crime of passion or sudden impulse, but a carefully premeditated murder requiring both chemical knowledge and intimate familiarity with Mrs. Weatherby's daily habits. Arthur Keene, clearly uncomfortable with the prolonged questioning, provided additional crucial information when pressed about access to the house. "Inspector, I should mention that several people have keys to Millfield House. Miss Carter, naturally, and myself for maintenance purposes. Mrs. Ashford has held a key for years due to her involvement in various social events." He paused, clearly reluctant to continue. "And Mrs. Weatherby gave Mr. Morrison a key last month when he was conducting research in her library about heritage rose varieties." This disclosure caused a visible stir throughout the drawing room. David Morrison's face flushed crimson as all eyes turned toward him, his previous nervousness now taking on a more sinister significance. "That's perfectly true," Morrison admitted defensively, his voice trembling slightly. "But I only used it twice, both times with Mrs. Weatherby's full knowledge and presence. I would never abuse that trust, regardless of our recent disagreement." Eleanor Vance, who had been listening intently to these revelations, stepped forward with information that added another layer of complexity to the investigation. "Inspector, I feel I should mention that Constance telephoned me yesterday specifically about changes she intended to make to her will. She was quite insistent that I come today, saying she had important family business to discuss that couldn't wait." Inspector Reeves made careful notes while studying each face in the room. "Mrs. Vance, can you be more specific about these intended changes?" "She was characteristically mysterious about the details," Eleanor replied, her composure carefully maintained. "Constance always preferred dramatic revelations to straightforward correspondence. She mentioned reconsidering certain family arrangements and wanted to discuss them in person before making any final decisions." The implications were not lost on anyone present. If Mrs. Weatherby had been planning significant changes to her will, it provided powerful motives that extended far beyond village gardening rivalries. P.C. Williams returned from interviewing early festival arrivals with additional testimony that further complicated the picture. "Inspector, Mrs. Higgins from the village mentioned seeing Mr. Morrison near the conservatory around 10:45. She said he appeared nervous and was carrying something small in his hand, though she couldn't identify what it was." Morrison's face went pale at this revelation. "I was checking on my rose display. I had a small spray bottle for treating aphids. There's nothing sinister about that." His protestations, while potentially innocent, only served to reinforce the growing pattern of evidence pointing in his direction. Miss Marple, maintaining her position near the window, continued her quiet observations while the official investigation proceeded. She noted several details that seemed to escape the others' attention. The way Eleanor Vance's eyes had sharpened when discussing the will changes, the manner in which Mrs. Ashford seemed more concerned with the festival's disruption than with the tragedy itself, and most significantly, the careful precision with which someone had planned this murder. The substitution of plain china for Mrs. Weatherby's distinctive cornflower pattern suggested a killer who understood the importance of avoiding detection through familiar objects. The tampered sugar cube indicated both chemical knowledge and access to the victim's routine. Most tellingly, the timing coincided perfectly with the festival preparations, when multiple people had legitimate reasons to be moving about the property. As Inspector Reeves announced that more detailed, individual interviews would commence immediately, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern. While young Morrison certainly appeared to be the most obvious suspect, with clear motive, opportunity, and now witness testimony placing him at the scene, her long experience with human nature suggested that the truth might be considerably more complex. The careful planning evident in this crime spoke of someone with both patience and intimate knowledge of Mrs. Weatherby's habits. The killer had used the festival preparations as cover, the victim's own routines against her, and had been clever enough to create multiple red herrings that would divert suspicion from the real motive. As the formal interviews began, Miss Marple settled back into her chair with her knitting, appearing to be nothing more than a harmless elderly observer. However, her sharp mind was already working through the implications of what she had witnessed. The game, as she had recognized from the beginning, was proving to be far more sophisticated than anyone yet realized. The obvious suspect was rarely the guilty party in her experience, and this case bore all the hallmarks of a carefully orchestrated deception designed to mislead the investigation from its very inception. The truth, she knew, lay hidden among the obvious facts, waiting for the right combination of observation and insight to bring it into the light. And in the quiet corners of her mind, certain patterns were already beginning to emerge that suggested the real murderer was still moving freely among them, protected by the very obviousness of the case being built against young Morrison. The formal interviews commenced in Mrs. Weatherby's oak-paneled study, where certificates from 3 decades of rose competitions watched silently as Inspector Reeves began his methodical questioning. David Morrison, summoned first, entered with the resigned air of a man already condemned, his hands trembling as he took the chair across from the inspector's temporary desk. "Mr. Morrison, please account for your movements between 10 and 11:30 this morning," Inspector Reeves began, his tone professionally neutral despite the mounting circumstantial evidence. Morrison's voice barely rose above a whisper as he recounted his activities. "I arrived early to check my display. The morning dew can damage delicate blooms, and I wanted everything perfect for judging. I spent most of the time adjusting arrangements and treating minor pest damage with a soap solution." When pressed about Mrs. Higgins's testimony placing him near the conservatory at the crucial time, Morrison's explanations seemed rehearsed yet desperate. "I noticed aphids on my grandmother's heritage roses. I went to mix a mild treatment using Mrs. Weatherby's supplies, as she had previously permitted." While this interrogation proceeded, Miss Marple, granted permission to remain in the drawing room, found herself strategically positioned where she could observe the comings and goings through the partially open study door. Her knitting provided perfect cover for her careful attention to each participant's behavior as they awaited their turn. During a brief lull in the proceedings, Miss Marple excused herself with the gentle manner of someone seeking a quieter corner. She made her way to the conservatory pantry, that small utilitarian space Arthur Keene had mentioned, drawn by an instinct honed through decades of observing domestic details that others overlooked. The narrow room smelled faintly of potting soil and dried herbs. On a scrubbed wooden shelf stood the blue cornflower tea service Miss Carter had described so precisely. Complete and undisturbed, its sugar bowl filled with perfectly regular cubes. Yet beside it sat a modest ceramic caddy containing coarse breakfast tea and several plain white cups with thin gilt rims, identical to the one found overturned in the rose garden. Miss Marple lifted the caddy's lid with gentle curiosity. Inside lay not the fragrant Earl Grey that Miss Carter had specified as Mrs. Weatherby's invariable preference, but a common, inexpensive breakfast blend. The incongruity struck her immediately. Mrs. Weatherby, known for her exacting standards and devotion to routine, would never voluntarily substitute inferior tea for her cherished morning ritual, particularly when her preferred items remained readily available. Returning to the drawing room as unobtrusively as she had departed, Miss Marple resumed her knitting while the interviews continued. Eleanor Vance's questioning revealed the first significant crack in previously established timelines. "Mrs. Vance," Inspector Reeves pressed, "Mrs. Ashford reports seeing your distinctive motor car near the church around 9:30, considerably earlier than you initially indicated." Eleanor's composed facade showed its first strain. "I may have arrived slightly earlier than I stated. I wanted to surprise Constance and perhaps assist with festival preparations. However, seeing how occupied everyone appeared, I decided to wait in the village until the appointed time." This revelation prompted additional questioning about Eleanor's activities during those unaccounted hours, creating new possibilities for opportunity that complicated the seemingly straightforward case against Morrison. The afternoon's most crucial testimony came from Lucy Pratt, the earnest young volunteer whom Miss Marple approached during a break in proceedings. Under gentle questioning, Lucy revealed the chain of events surrounding the fatal tea service. Mrs. Ashford instructed me to prepare a tray around 10:50, Lucy explained, her voice trembling slightly. 1 cup with a saucer, milk jug, and sugar. She was particular about placing a single cube on the saucer to prevent spillage. I remember the cup had a hairline crack that I had to position carefully. Most significantly, Lucy confirmed that Arthur Keene had volunteered to carry the prepared tray to Mrs. Weatherby. He said he was heading to the Rose Garden anyway, and that I shouldn't leave the refreshment station unattended. This testimony established a clear chain of custody for the poisoned tea, yet Miss Marple noted how it also revealed the careful planning required for the substitution. Someone had ensured that Mrs. Weatherby received common tea in plain china rather than her customary Earl Grey in the blue cornflower service, a deliberate deviation designed to suggest she had prepared the refreshment herself. Inspector Reeves's investigation took another dramatic turn when Sergeant Miller arrived with news from the local chemist. A small quantity of potassium cyanide had been purchased the previous week, signed for in the name H. Ashford for cleaning gold fittings. Mrs. Ashford's indignant denial rang through the drawing room. "That signature is forged. I have never purchased such chemicals, and I resent the implication." Miss Marple observed the reactions around the room with particular interest. While Mrs. Ashford's outrage appeared genuine, the revelation served to muddy the investigative waters further, creating additional suspects while potentially deflecting attention from the true culprit. As the formal interviews concluded, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern. The substituted tea service, the forged chemical purchase, the carefully timed festival preparations, all suggested a killer of considerable sophistication who understood both Mrs. Weatherby's habits and the investigative process itself. The murderer had used the victim's own routines against her, creating a web of false evidence designed to implicate obvious suspects while concealing their true identity. The common breakfast tea whispered of deliberate deception, while the forged signature provided convenient misdirection. Most troubling was the realization that the killer remained among them, protected by the very complexity of the web they had woven. The game, Miss Marple recognized with quiet certainty, was entering its most dangerous phase, where the murderer's desperation might drive them to even greater risks to preserve their carefully constructed deception. Evenings settled over Millfield House with the weight of unspoken truths, the festival bunting hanging limp in the still air like abandoned hopes. Inspector Reeves, having concluded his formal interviews, found himself confronting evidence that painted an increasingly complex picture of premeditation and deception. The forged chemical purchase had opened questions that extended far beyond simple garden rivalries or inheritance disputes. Miss Marple, who had remained quietly observant throughout the afternoon's proceedings, approached Miss Carter with the gentle manner of someone offering comfort rather than seeking information. The companion, still shaken by the morning's discovery, welcomed the elderly lady's presence with visible relief. "Such a terrible shock for you, dear," Miss Marple murmured, sympathetically, settling beside Miss Carter in the small morning room. "Mrs. Weatherby was so particular about her routines, wasn't she? I imagine any change would have been quite noticeable." Miss Carter nodded, her hands twisting her handkerchief. She was indeed very set in her ways, though recently— She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. Just a fortnight ago, she made quite a dramatic decision about her morning tea. Her dentist had been after her for months to reduce sugar, and she finally submitted. Made quite a point of pride about it, actually. Said she could taste the tea properly without sweetening, that it cleared her head. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. How admirable of her, even at her 11 o'clock tea in the Rose Garden. "Especially then," Miss Carter replied firmly. She was most insistent about it. I had to remove the sugar bowl from her tray entirely, as she said the temptation was too great otherwise. This revelation struck Miss Marple with the force of a key turning in a well-oiled lock. If Mrs. Weatherby had sworn off sugar completely, the poisoned cube placed ceremoniously upon the saucer represented not knowledge of her habits, but a carefully calculated strategy to overcome her new resolve. The inferior breakfast tea, harsh to the palate compared to her beloved Earl Grey, would naturally prompt even a determined woman to reach reflexively for sweetening to correct what she would perceive as an error in preparation. Meanwhile, Arthur Keene approached Inspector Reeves with obvious reluctance, his weathered hands working nervously at his cap. "Inspector, there's something I should have mentioned earlier. Yesterday afternoon I discovered signs that someone had been in Mrs. Weatherby's private greenhouse without permission. Several chemical containers were disturbed, including compounds she used for treating plant diseases. The implications sent a chill through the assembled company. Mrs. Weatherby's greenhouse contained an extensive collection of horticultural chemicals, many potentially lethal in concentrated doses. This break-in suggested the murderer had been planning the crime for at least 24 hours, methodically gathering materials while establishing alibis for the actual murder." Dr. Hartwell, who had maintained professional composure throughout the investigation, stepped forward with information that added another disturbing dimension. "Inspector, I feel I should mention that Mrs. Weatherby consulted me privately last week about digestive difficulties. She was experiencing symptoms that, in retrospect, might have suggested gradual poisoning, though we attributed them to stress from festival preparations at the time." Miss Marple absorbed this information with quiet intensity, a campaign of small doses designed to weaken the victim before the fatal attack, spoke of patience and calculation that went far beyond passionate impulse. The murderer's sophisticated planning was becoming increasingly apparent with each revelation. As evening approached, Sergeant Miller returned from examining Mrs. Weatherby's personal effects with a document that confirmed Eleanor Vance's earlier testimony. A recent letter from a London solicitor indicated that Mrs. Weatherby had indeed initiated discussions about revising her estate, specifically mentioning reallocating certain assets due to recent disappointments. Eleanor Vance, when questioned again about this correspondence, maintained her earlier account while displaying subtle signs of strain. Constance was characteristically mysterious about the details. She mentioned reconsidering family arrangements, hinting that some distant relatives might be disinherited, while others, perhaps myself, might benefit more substantially. Inspector Reeves, noting Eleanor's careful precision in recounting these conversations, pressed for more specific details about her movements the previous day. "Mrs. Vance, you mentioned being in London on Tuesday. Can you be more specific about the timing?" "I was attending a committee meeting at my club throughout Tuesday evening," Eleanor replied quickly, then caught herself with a slight flush. "That is, I assumed you were asking about the evening hours." Miss Marple noted this slip with particular interest. The witness who had reported seeing someone near the greenhouse hadn't specified the time of day, yet Eleanor had immediately referenced the evening. Such precision often indicated guilty knowledge rather than innocent confusion. During a quiet moment, Miss Marple excused herself for a brief walk in the garden, ostensibly to clear her head after the day's revelations. Near the small iron gate in the yew hedge, she discovered additional physical evidence that others had overlooked. A pale smear of dried milk on the dark wood, and a torn scrap of paper with partial lettering that appeared to be from a rose competition entry label. The evidence confirmed that someone carrying a tray had passed through this gate hurriedly, catching the label and spilling milk in their haste. Combined with Arthur Keene's testimony about delivering the tea via the side path, it established the logistics of how the poisoned refreshment had reached its intended victim. As the formal investigation continued, Miss Marple observed the subtle changes in behavior among the assembled suspects. Mrs. Ashford's initial outrage about the forged signature was giving way to a more complex expression of understanding, as if she was beginning to grasp how thoroughly she had been implicated in the crime. David Morrison, while still nervous, seemed less isolated as evidence emerged, suggesting a more sophisticated conspiracy than simple garden rivalry. Most significantly, Miss Marple noted how the killer's careful planning had anticipated the investigation's direction, creating false trails and planting evidence with the skill of someone familiar with police methodology. The substituted tea service, the forged chemical purchase, the carefully timed break-in, all suggested a murderer who understood both Mrs. Weatherby's habits and investigative procedures. As darkness settled over the rose garden where the morning's tragedy had unfolded, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern. The truth lay not in the obvious motives and public disputes that dominated surface conversations, but in some deeper calculation that connected the victim's daily routines, her family relationships, and the intricate social dynamics of Little Wickham's seemingly peaceful community. The game, as she had recognized from the beginning, was proving far more sophisticated than anyone yet realized. The real murderer remained among them, protected by the very complexity of the web they had woven, using the village's own prejudices and assumptions as camouflage for their carefully orchestrated deception. Tomorrow, Miss Marple knew, would bring the investigation to its crucial turning point, where the accumulated evidence would either reveal the truth or allow the killer to escape behind an even more elaborate facade of innocence. Morning dawned with a heavy hush over Little Wickham, the roses at Millfield House dripping with dew, their beauty untouched by the spectre that still haunted the estate. Inspector Reeves, his resolve sharpened by a night's restless contemplation, returned before most had finished their tea, determined to press forward while the village's nerves were still raw. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, joined him near the conservatory pantry, where the investigation was set to resume. She quietly relayed what she'd learned from Miss Carter, that Mrs. Weatherby, having recently sworn off sugar, would never have accepted a cube with her tea, unless, of course, something had induced her to break her resolve. Inspector Reeves, picking up on this, arranged for Lucy Pratt and Arthur Keene to reconstruct the tea tray. It was carried along the side garden path, milk jug trembling at the small iron gate, the very point where, the day before, Miss Marple had noticed the dried smear and torn label. The reconstruction confirmed the journey of the fatal tea and the deliberate planning that had gone into its delivery. As the group returned to the house, a sharp cry and the frantic clang of the greenhouse bell drew everyone's attention. Smoke curled over the glass roof. Reeves, Miller, and Arthur rushed in, followed at a measured pace by Miss Marple. Inside, a hasty fire had scorched the potting bench and blackened a shallow zinc tray. Among the charred remains, Sergeant Miller recovered a fragment of thick, creamy paper bearing the faint watermark of a London solicitor and the partial word "Codic." Nearby, a half-melted pellet of blue sealing wax, the very color Mrs. Weatherby used for her private papers, confirmed that this was a codicil to her will, now nearly destroyed. Eleanor Vance, arriving at the scene, could not hide her distress. "Codicil?" she breathed, her hand trembling at her throat. Then she had already drafted. She stopped short, mastering her expression, but her shock did not go unnoticed by Miss Marple, who remembered the delicate Parma violet fragrance Eleanor favored. A subtle detail, but one that the chemist's assistant had also mentioned when describing the woman who purchased the cyanide. Back in the house, Inspector Reeves examined the study. No sign of forced entry. The window catch bore scratches consistent with a staged break-in, not a real one. Miss Carter, pale and shaken, revealed the hiding place for Mrs. Weatherby's legal papers, a false back in the right-hand cabinet drawer, now standing open. She insisted she hadn't touched it, and her tears seemed genuine. Sergeant Miller soon brought more troubling news. Searching the refreshment tent, he found a second sugar cube, wrapped in greaseproof paper and hidden beneath napkins, a cube with a puncture mark, but this time the preparation was clumsy, the surface sticky as if the poison had seeped out. Lucy Pratt swore she hadn't put it there. Arthur denied ever instructing her to keep a spare. The contradictions between them heightened the sense of a frame-up, or perhaps a deeper conspiracy. Throughout the morning, the investigation's psychological dimension deepened. Miss Marple, quietly observing, noted how Eleanor's movements in the conservatory betrayed a familiarity that went beyond childhood recollection, and how her hands avoided the very shelf where a hidden sugar cube had been tucked away. She also noted the way Mrs. Ashford bristled at the mention of lemon verbena scent, while Eleanor said nothing about the trace of violets the chemist remembered. Inspector Reeves, meanwhile, was briefed by Sergeant Miller on the forged signature for the cyanide purchase. The forger had not tried to mimic Mrs. Ashford's hand, but had instead disguised their own, revealing a sophisticated effort to mislead any handwriting analysis. Arthur Keene, when pressed again about the greenhouse break-in, noted that nothing was disturbed except the specific chemicals required, a sign of intimate knowledge and not a random theft. As the morning wore on, the case's motive shifted dramatically. Sergeant Miller returned from the county solicitor's office with a sealed envelope. Reeves broke it open and read the new will Mrs. Weatherby had signed. The old will had left everything to Eleanor Vance. The new will, signed just the previous day, left the entire estate to the Little Wickham Horticultural Scholarship Fund, to be administered by Dr. Hartwell, and specifically disinherited Eleanor, citing irreconcilable differences. The shock in the room was palpable. Eleanor, who had maintained an air of polite composure, turned stark white. "No, that's impossible," she stammered. "Constance told me. She said she was reallocating certain assets to benefit me." Inspector Reeves' gaze was unyielding. "Yet according to this, you were to receive nothing." This revelation reoriented the investigation. Eleanor's motive had transformed from anticipated gain to desperate loss, and her earlier lies about her arrival and her expectations were now starkly exposed. At the same time, Dr. Hartwell, previously above suspicion, was now named as the estate's administrator, which raised new questions, especially given Mrs. Weatherby's draft letter found in her blotter, accusing an unnamed judge of undue influence at past competitions. With the village abuzz and the suspect's nerves fraying, Miss Marple requested a small favor from Inspector Reeves: permission to speak, informally and alone, with each principal figure by the hearth in the morning room. Reeves, recognizing her unique gifts, agreed. While the official investigation had grown ever more tangled, Miss Marple believed that in the gentle setting of a domestic room, and with the quiet tick of the mantel clock as a background, people tended to reveal their true selves, often without realizing it. As the sun rose higher, the entire case seemed to teeter on the edge of revelation. The killer's careful plans, poison, substitution, staged evidence, and even arson, had been clever, but not clever enough to escape the subtle scrutiny of Miss Marple's eye for the ordinary and her deep faith in human nature's revealing patterns. Miss Marple settled into the comfortable chair by the morning-room hearth, her knitting basket positioned precisely where the afternoon light would catch the wool's subtle colors. Inspector Reeves had agreed to her unconventional request with the weary recognition of someone who had learned to trust methods that defied conventional police procedure. The room itself, with its chintz curtains and family photographs, seemed designed to encourage confidences, and Miss Marple had long understood that people often revealed their deepest truths in such domestic settings. Eleanor Vance entered first, her earlier composure now brittle as morning frost. She chose the settee with practiced grace, though Miss Marple noted how her hands betrayed a tremor that contradicted her controlled demeanor. The faint scent of Parma violets clung to her, a detail that Miss Marple filed away with the same care she devoted to counting stitches. "Such a dreadful shock for you, my dear," Miss Marple began conversationally, her needles clicking in a soothing rhythm, arriving to such terrible news and then learning about the will changes. Family relationships can be so complex, particularly when one has expectations. She paused, appearing to concentrate on a particularly intricate pattern. "I do hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I've been wondering about your recent visits to Little Wickham." Miss Carter mentioned that Constance had become quite particular about her routines lately. Eleanor's response came too quickly, betraying the rehearsed quality that Miss Marple had noted in her earlier statements. Constance and I had grown closer in recent years. She often felt isolated here, surrounded by people who resented her success. Her voice carried a defensive edge. As for her routines, she was always rather set in her ways, though I couldn't say I paid particular attention to such domestic details. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically while observing Eleanor's unconscious gesture toward her throat, where a small crystal bottle hung on a delicate chain beneath her blouse. "Of course, dear, though I imagine someone as observant as yourself would notice her recent decision about sugar. Such willpower, giving it up entirely after so many years." Miss Carter was quite impressed by her determination. The effect was immediate and telling. Eleanor's carefully maintained facade cracked slightly as she struggled with information that contradicted her claimed distance from her cousin's daily life. That is, Constance mentioned something about dietary changes, but she was always trying various health improvements. I didn't realize she had been so successful with this particular effort. Dr. Hartwell's interview followed, and his demeanor proved equally instructive. The distinguished judge entered with professional confidence, but Miss Marple detected underlying anxiety that went beyond concern for his reputation. His response to questions about the estate appointment revealed careful preparation, yet when she mentioned Mrs. Weatherby's draft letter about judging impropriety, his defensive explanation about maintaining absolute impartiality rang hollow against his obvious familiarity with accusations he claimed never to have seen. "Such responsibility, being named as estate administrator," Miss Marple observed gently. "Though I imagine you had considerable discussions with Mrs. Weatherby about the scholarship's objectives. She was quite passionate about maintaining standards, wasn't she? Perhaps even concerned about influences that might compromise the integrity of future competitions." Dr. Hartwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Weatherby was indeed committed to excellence. Our conversations were always professional, focused on horticultural merit rather than personal considerations. He paused, then added with studied casualness, "She could be quite forceful in expressing her views about what constituted proper judging standards." Mrs. Ashford entered bristling with defensive energy and a cloud of lemon verbena that seemed to announce her presence. Her indignation about the forged signature was immediate and vehement, yet Miss Marple noted how she protested too much, as if the very suggestion was personally offensive, rather than simply mistaken. "Such a distinctive scent, Parma violets, that the chemist mentioned," Miss Marple observed mildly. "So different from the fresh lemon verbena you favor. One often associates people with their particular fragrances, don't you find? It's such a personal choice, isn't it?" Mrs. Ashford's reaction was swift and telling. "Parma violets? Good heavens, no. I wouldn't be caught dead in such an old-fashioned scent. It's so cloying, so unsuitable for a woman of modern sensibilities." Her vehemence seemed disproportionate to the casual observation, suggesting deeper concerns about scent associations. Arthur Keane's conversation revealed the most practical insights into the crime's execution. His intimate knowledge of the property's layout and chemical storage, combined with his obvious nervousness about the greenhouse break-in, painted a picture of someone who understood exactly how the murder had been accomplished, even if he hadn't committed it himself. "That little gate by the yew hedge," Miss Marple mentioned casually. "Always a bit tricky when carrying a tray, I imagine. And the greenhouse chemicals, such specific knowledge required to select the right substances. One wonders how anyone unfamiliar with Mrs. Weatherby's storage systems would know which containers to disturb." Arthur's response revealed both knowledge and fear. "Aye, the gate's been stiff this season. Needs oiling, and the chemicals. Well, Mrs. Weatherby kept everything labeled proper-like. Anyone with sense could find what they needed." given time. David Morrison's genuine distress provided a stark contrast to the calculated responses of the others. His passionate defense of his grandmother's roses and his obvious shock at being suspected revealed someone reacting with authentic emotion rather than careful preparation. As the afternoon progressed and each conversation concluded, Miss Marple found herself constructing a mental map of deception that grew clearer with each revelation. The killer had demonstrated not only intimate knowledge of Mrs. Weatherby's routines and vulnerabilities, but also a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate both evidence and witnesses. During a brief interlude, Miss Marple requested a small favor from Sergeant Miller. Within the hour, carefully crafted rumors began circulating through the house. That the burned codicil had contained provisions for a faithful servant, that it had ensured an allowance for family members, and that it had placed restrictions on the scholarship administration. Each rumor was strategically delivered to create maximum psychological pressure on the guilty party. Miss Marple observed the reactions with the patience of someone who had spent decades studying human nature. The killer's careful planning had been masterful, using the victim's own habits against her, creating false trails through forged signatures and planted evidence, and even attempting to destroy documentary evidence that might reveal their true motive. Yet in their very sophistication, they had revealed themselves. The substituted tea service, the knowledge of Mrs. Weatherby's dietary changes, the familiarity with her chemical storage, and most tellingly, the psychological manipulation of other suspects through carefully planted evidence, all pointed to someone who had been planning this crime with meticulous attention to detail. As evening shadows lengthened across the rose garden where the morning's tragedy had unfolded, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that had emerged. The truth lay not in the obvious motives of inheritance or competition, but in something far more calculated and cold-blooded. The game, as she had recognized from the beginning, was approaching its final moves, and tomorrow would bring the revelation that would expose the killer's carefully constructed facade. The murderer remained among them, protected by the very complexity of their deception, but Miss Marple was confident that their own cleverness would ultimately prove their undoing. In her long experience, those who planned too carefully often forgot that human nature itself was the most revealing evidence of all. The morning brought an unexpected development that would prove crucial to Miss Marple's understanding of the case. A registered envelope arrived from Mrs. Weatherby's London solicitor, intercepted by P.C. Williams and delivered directly to Inspector Reeves. The contents revealed that Mrs. Weatherby had indeed lodged a sealed codicil with her legal representatives the previous afternoon, rendering the greenhouse fire's destruction of her personal copy entirely meaningless. Inspector Reeves read the document aloud to the assembled household. The codicil provided modest bequests to Miss Carter and Arthur Keene, while establishing additional oversight for the scholarship fund through multiple trustees rather than Dr. Hartwell's sole administration. Most significantly, it confirmed Eleanor Vance's complete disinheritance, making her desperate journey from London utterly futile. Miss Marple observed the reactions with keen interest. Eleanor's carefully maintained composure showed its first genuine crack, while Dr. Hartwell's flush at the mention of oversight trustees suggested concerns that went beyond mere professional pride. Arthur Keene's bewildered gratitude seemed entirely authentic, while Miss Carter's relief was palpable. During the morning's activities, Miss Marple implemented a subtle strategy that had served her well in previous investigations. She requested that Sergeant Miller circulate carefully crafted rumors about the burned codicil's supposed contents, each tailored to create maximum psychological pressure on different suspects. Eleanor heard whispers of unexpected family allowances. Arthur was told of substantial legacies for loyal servants, and Dr. Hartwell learned of stringent new restrictions on scholarship administration. The responses proved illuminating. Eleanor's sudden interest in family genealogy and her probing questions about distant relatives revealed a desperate attempt to establish alternative claims to inheritance. Her renewed animation contrasted sharply with her earlier resignation, suggesting that hope, however false, had rekindled her determination. Dr. Hartwell's reaction proved most telling. Rather than expressing mere curiosity about the rumors, he sought out Inspector Reeves with specific, authoritative corrections about the Scholarship Fund's administration. His detailed knowledge of provisions that should have been destroyed in the greenhouse fire revealed intimate familiarity with documents he claimed never to have seen. When he insisted that Mrs. Weatherby had intended complete autonomy for the fund's administration, he demonstrated knowledge that only the killer or the solicitor possessed. The psychological pressure intensified when Lucy Pratt, under Miss Marple's gentle questioning, revealed additional details about the morning's tea preparation. She had been instructed by someone to place sugar conveniently on the saucer, despite Mrs. Weatherby's well-known recent abstinence. The person giving these instructions had claimed it was just in case she changed her mind, demonstrating knowledge of her dietary restrictions while planning to exploit them. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a subtle but significant detail during the afternoon's activities. When discussing Mrs. Weatherby's morning routine, Dr. Hartwell had mentioned her punctual 11 o'clock tea with 1 sugar, contradicting the established fact of her recent dietary changes. An innocent person familiar with her older habits might make such an error, but combined with his other revelations, it suggested someone whose knowledge was both intimate and dangerously outdated. The investigation took another crucial turn when Arthur Keene, emboldened by news of his legacy, revealed information he had previously withheld. On the morning of the murder, he had observed Dr. Hartwell near the conservatory pantry at approximately 10:30, carrying what appeared to be a small vial or bottle. At the time, Arthur had assumed it contained plant nutrients or pest control solution, as Dr. Hartwell often examined Mrs. Weatherby's horticultural supplies during his visits. This testimony, combined with Dr. Hartwell's scientific background and access to chemical supplies, painted an increasingly damning picture. His reputation as a judge had provided perfect cover for frequent visits to Millfield House, allowing him to study Mrs. Weatherby's routines and access her domestic arrangements without suspicion. Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern while maintaining her unobtrusive observation post. The killer had demonstrated remarkable sophistication in their planning, using Mrs. Weatherby's own habits against her while creating multiple false trails to confuse the investigation. The forged chemical purchase in Mrs. Ashford's name, the planted evidence implicating David Morrison, and the staged greenhouse break-in all served to deflect suspicion from the true perpetrator. Most significantly, the murderer had exploited Mrs. Weatherby's recent dietary changes with deadly precision. By serving inferior tea in unfamiliar china, they had created a situation where even a determined woman would instinctively reach for sugar to improve the taste. The poisoned cube, carefully prepared and positioned, had turned her own refined palate into an instrument of destruction. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the rose garden, Miss Marple prepared for the final phase of her investigation. The psychological pressure had revealed crucial information. The physical evidence was falling into place, and the killer's careful facade was beginning to crumble under scrutiny. Inspector Reeves, recognizing the significance of the accumulated evidence, announced that formal charges would be filed within hours. The investigation had moved beyond speculation to certainty, though Miss Marple knew that the final confrontation would require delicate handling to ensure complete confession and closure. The game, as she had recognized from the beginning, was approaching its inevitable conclusion. The killer's sophisticated planning had been masterful, but their own cleverness had ultimately provided the evidence necessary for their downfall. Human nature, in all its complexity and contradiction, had once again proven to be both the source of the crime and the key to its solution. Tomorrow would bring the final revelation that would expose the murderer's carefully constructed deception and restore peace to Little Wickham's shattered community. The final confrontation unfolded in Mrs. Weatherby's drawing room as afternoon shadows lengthened across the rose garden, transforming the scene of morning tragedy into something almost peaceful. Inspector Reeves had assembled all the principal figures at Miss Marple's gentle request, though she suspected only one among them truly understood the gravity of this final gathering. The elderly lady sat quietly by the window, her knitting basket set aside, her pale blue eyes moving thoughtfully between the assembled faces. "Inspector Reeves has asked me to share my observations about this most instructive case," Miss Marple began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty. "The murderer demonstrated remarkable sophistication, creating multiple false trails while concealing their true motive. Yet ultimately, they revealed themselves through their very cleverness and intimate knowledge of both Mrs. Weatherby's habits and investigative procedures." She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing with gentle relentlessness. "The crime appeared complex, with several suspects possessing both motive and opportunity. However, the sophistication of the planning revealed its author quite clearly to anyone willing to observe human nature carefully." Dr. Hartwell shifted uncomfortably, his professional composure showing subtle signs of strain. Eleanor Vance maintained her controlled demeanor, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor. The others watched with the fascination of people witnessing a master craftsman reveal her methods. "The killer understood Mrs. Weatherby's routines intimately," Miss Marple continued, "particularly her recent decision to abstain from sugar entirely. This knowledge was crucial because the poisoned cube was not simply placed in her tea, it was positioned as a psychological trap. By serving inferior breakfast tea in unfamiliar plain china rather than her beloved cornflower service, the murderer ensured that even a woman of iron determination would instinctively reach for sweetening to correct the unpalatable taste." Miss Marple's gaze moved to Dr. Hartwell with particular attention. "Yesterday, Dr. Hartwell, you mentioned Mrs. Weatherby's punctual 11 o'clock tea with 1 sugar. Yet Miss Carter had removed the sugar bowl from her tray entirely weeks ago to help her maintain her dietary resolve. Such a specific error suggests not faulty memory, but guilty knowledge of the trap you had prepared." The room fell silent except for the steady tick of the mantel clock. Dr. Hartwell's face had grown pale, though he maintained his dignified bearing. "Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting that a simple mistake in recollection indicates guilt?" "Not alone, certainly," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile that held no warmth. "But when combined with your detailed knowledge of the burned codicil's contents, knowledge you demonstrated when correcting rumors about provisions that should have been destroyed, it becomes quite revealing. Only the person who set that fire, or someone intimately familiar with those documents, could have possessed such specific information about complete autonomy for scholarship administration." She continued with inexorable logic. "There was also Arthur's testimony about seeing you near the conservatory with a small vial at the crucial time, your access to the chemical compounds needed for the poisoned cube, and your scientific precision in calculating the dosage. Most tellingly, you understood that Mrs. Weatherby's letter threatened not just your reputation, but your freedom, as accepting influence in judging constitutes fraud." Dr. Hartwell's composure finally cracked. "This is preposterous. You're building accusations on coincidence and speculation." Miss Marple rose slowly and moved to the tea service that had been prepared at her request. 2 cups, 1 from the blue cornflower service, 1 plain white with gilt trim, and a single sugar cube positioned precisely on the white saucer. "Perhaps you would demonstrate, Dr. Hartwell, how one should properly position a sugar cube to prevent spillage, as you instructed Lucy yesterday morning?" The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Dr. Hartwell, responding with the automatic precision of someone who had performed this action before, stepped forward and adjusted the cube with practiced efficiency. "One steadies it thus against the saucer's edge," he said, the words emerging before caution could restrain them. "The heat cracks the surface, and He stopped abruptly, as if hearing himself for the first time, understanding that he had just demonstrated knowledge no innocent person should possess. The specific technique for positioning a poisoned sugar cube, the intimate familiarity with its preparation, all revealed through his unconscious response to Miss Marple's gentle request. "How very practical," Miss Marple murmured. "Exactly as you instructed Lucy when preparing the fatal tray. Such precise knowledge of technique suggests considerable experience with the method." The psychological pressure had achieved its purpose. Dr. Hartwell's carefully constructed facade crumbled completely as he sank into his chair, the weight of exposure finally overwhelming his defenses. "She was going to destroy everything," he whispered, his authoritative voice now hollow with defeat. 30 years of building respect, of serving the community, all threatened by her self-righteous accusations about judging irregularities. She had no proof, only suspicions, but her influence would have ruined my reputation entirely. Inspector Reeves stepped forward with professional efficiency. "Dr. Geoffrey Hartwell, I arrest you for the murder of Mrs. Constance Weatherby." As the formal arrest proceeded, the confession emerged in fragments of justification and regret. The gradual poisoning over several days, the calculated exploitation of Mrs. Weatherby's refined palate and dietary changes, the staged evidence designed to implicate others, all revealed the mind of someone who had planned murder with scientific precision while desperately trying to preserve a reputation built on decades of subtle corruption. As Dr. Hartwell was led away, the remaining assembly sat in stunned silence. The revelation that their respected judge had been capable of such calculated evil shattered assumptions about character and respectability that had seemed unshakable. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with quiet satisfaction, her work complete. The sophisticated planning that had initially obscured the killer's identity had ultimately provided the very evidence necessary for conviction. Human nature, in all its complexity and contradiction, had once again proven to be both the source of the crime and the key to its solution. As she prepared to leave Millfield House, Miss Marple reflected on the eternal human capacity for both corruption and justice. The roses continued blooming in their magnificent profusion, untouched by the darkness that had briefly shadowed their beauty. A reminder that nature's cycles continue regardless of human frailty, and that truth, however carefully concealed, inevitably finds its way into the light.